It's a very exciting time to look at the world of economics. I'm an economist, and most of what makes it exciting is banking and these big macroeconomic issues that we face right now. I don't know a lot about that stuff, so we can talk about it over the reception if anybody wants to, but don't ask me what's going to happen to interest rates or the stock market or how we should handle this bank bailout, because I don't know anything you don't. But what I do know, what I do spend a lot of time thinking about is labor markets, and I'm a labor economist, like I said, and I have a few thoughts that, we've been teaching the HR class here. I've been teaching it for a long time, and the core human resource management class we teach, I like to think it really doesn't matter what country you work in, what time, year-wise you're working, and so forth. The general principles we talk about should apply just about anywhere, anytime. Having said that, we live in a very different economy than we lived in a year or two ago. And so what I want to talk about tonight is, okay, taking the general principles you learned here in school, and maybe they didn't have that class, but whatever other classes you learned here at school and other things you've learned out in your working careers, and how do we tweak those a little bit from a managerial point of view, and then more broadly, how do we think about the labor market in its current condition as opposed to how it was a couple of years ago. So that's what I want to do tonight. I've got plenty of material. I don't quite know whether, should we sort of go, you want to do this like a class where people interrupt as I go, or you want me to just whiz through some slides and then we can open it up at the end? I don't have a strong opinion on this. Go. Since I know Mike and a couple of the other people, I'll start with them. And then I have to, no. So you should interrupt me if you want to, and then at the end, if we have extra time, we'll go back to things that you were too shy to ask about along the way. Let's do that. So I want to talk about four basic things, and these are four economic concepts or terms, economic terms, or in one case just a single word, and that's where I want to go through these in sort of step by step. And the first one is just business cycles in the labor market. So we'll talk about the state of the labor market and what that means. Then I want to talk about how a concept that's very important in any labor market, adverse selection, is particularly important, or I don't know if it's particularly important, but it changes in certain ways during the kinds of labor markets we're in now. Then I want to talk about incentives. We in the business school who teach the HR class and other economists in the business school think a lot about incentives. And incentives change a little bit in the current environment. Not a lot, but a little bit, and we want to talk about that. And then finally, I just want to sort of tell you about some research I did on Stanford MBAs, and I don't know that it's going to have any big effect on your particular life. You hopefully will find it a little bit interesting, and depending on when you graduated, you can blame any problems in your life on what I'm going to show you, so that'll be useful. Now, those are, economic terms. That's all fine. I hang around economists who would all sort of say, oh, adverse selection, whatever, initial conditions, that means a lot to me. But I'm going to tell you the plain English version of each of these four terms now. The first one is, how screwed are we in terms of the current labor market? Second one is, how do you hire and fire the right people? And then incentives is really a nice way of saying, we're going to talk about those AIG bastards. And then finally, we'll talk about graduating at the wrong time, which is what our students are doing right now. And it's not as grim. People interpret what I'm going to tell you there in a very grim manner, and I'm going to tell you that you don't need to, but we'll get to that. So this is not a very pretty chart for a lot of people. Hopefully not too many of you in this room, but certainly for a lot of people in the American economy, the unemployment rate was going along at 4.5%, which is pretty good for a long time. And then the sort of deterioration in the job market has been fast and furious. And you don't need this graph for me to know that. You read the newspaper and hear it on the news and so forth. And this really understates the pain in the labor market right now. And the reason I say that is we measure unemployment, but other people also, we talk a lot about the unemployment rate, but there's another rate that I think is probably just as important, which is the underemployment rate. So there are a lot of people who have jobs, but they're either working fewer hours than they would like to work, or they have jobs that they don't feel sort of come up to either the compensation they feel they would like to be earning, or the types of tasks they would like to be doing, and so forth. So underemployment rates are up at least 15% and rising, as opposed to just 8% for the unemployment rate. So here's a broader look back in history. And the good news is, in our lifetimes, we've seen worse. Right? So we're up at above 8% now. In California, I can't remember if we've hit 10% or not, but we're right skidding around 10% already. And if you look back, even in our lifetimes, 10% has been hit, and we may well be on our way there. And if that's as far as we get, it's not going to be the worst job market that any of us have lived through. It may be the worst some of us have gone through in terms of our careers if you started working after 1982 or 83. But the real concern is, are we going to stop at 10% with maybe 20% underemployment, or is it going to just keep going? And if I hope not, and I don't think so, but historically we're not sort of in danger territory in terms of this is so much worse than the earlier recessions, but people project that it could get there. Okay.
Can I just ask you a question? Does the unemployment also include those who have stopped looking for work?
No, this doesn't include people who stopped looking for work. So you could think about, I think they're called discouraged workers is the term for them, and you would add another % or 2 on top of that. Okay, right? So I don't know what the numbers are. That's a good question. You can look at what I could have presented, which would give you that, is the employment rate. So people talk about the unemployment rate. An alternative way is to look at the employment rate, which is what fraction of people in a certain age range have jobs. And that controls for that sort of thing. But, and you'd see certainly that's gone down a little bit. By the way, men and women have historically pretty tight relationship between their unemployment rates. Now, I don't know if you've caught this nuance in the news, but there's this particular set of job loss so far has been harder on men than on women. Okay, and the reason for that is the job losses have been particularly bad in the last few months to a year in construction and manufacturing. Very male-dominated jobs historically. So in fact, you even heard, and you can sort of see this out here, where the male rate is jumping quite a bit more than the female rate. Now, you might have even heard this during the stimulus debate, the debate about the stimulus package. There were people arguing that it was somewhat sexist in that a lot of the jobs that people were talking about creating were going to be male-oriented jobs. Okay? And the counter-argument to that was, well, the recession is hurting male workers more than female workers so far, and we want, so therefore you might address it that way or not. That came up a little bit. The good news for all of us in this room who've all had quite a bit of education is unemployment in all states of the economy is typically a lot worse if you have less education. So the top line is high school dropouts, and you can see historically, this 10% unemployment we were talking about, that's kind of almost typical for high school dropouts, whereas for college graduates, we're talking about, when it gets to 3%, that's really bad unemployment. And in fact, I just found these numbers today. I found them kind of interesting. If you look at the February unemployment, just to sort of give you the numbers to highlight what's going on there, for high school dropouts or for college graduates, sorry, that's not very clear, but so unemployment in February was 12.6%, and it's 4.1% here. So certainly a lot of college graduates are out of work, and by historical standards, that's double what it was, back in 2000. But it's a lot lower than this. And then now coming back to my previous answer to your question, in fact, if you look at this is what we call if you look at the overall labor force participation rate, this is where you see quite a dramatic thing going on, which is only 46% of high school dropouts are actually in the labor force. Okay? So 12.6% of these, and that's a 12.6% rate of this group which is already a very selected group relative to overall, right? So if you took the overall high school drop, of all high school dropouts, you have something on the order of 38% of them have jobs, okay? Because it's 46% either have one or want one, 12.6% of that doesn't. 12.6% of 46% is looking for a job. Whereas with college graduates, this is 78%. Okay? So that's obviously a huge difference in terms of the sort of fraction of this group that is actually working when you sort of combine these two things. So as you know, that's the good news. Now, having said that, does that mean college graduates all have it easy and there's nothing to worry about? No. Because look at, I mean, there have been layoffs at these firms in recent weeks. Some of them, Google not so big, but Microsoft had a really sizable layoff not long ago. And they're not laying off factory workers or, you know, retail guys who stock shelves for $8 an hour. They're laying off very highly skilled, well-educated people. Goldman Sachs, you know, they're lucky to be in business relative to some of their competitors, I guess. You know, at Stanford, there's been some job losses, I'm sorry to say. Erica mentioned in my introduction that I do a lot of research on law firms, and there's this web page that sort of, it's law firm gossip, and I've become, you know, I'm probably the only non-lawyer who finds this at all interesting, but I go check out the law firm gossip. And these really big law firms are laying off people in large numbers who went to very good law schools. I mean, we're not talking about, again, unskilled people being laid off. NPR and PBS, I'm, you know, big fan of these institutions. Major League Baseball had some layoffs in the home offices, not the players, of course. But, you know, so the point is, yes, much lower unemployment rates, but in the and despite what you read sometimes in Fortune magazine, the gap here hasn't really narrowed over time. But having said that, unemployment is certainly reaching higher and higher, is reaching up to the top levels of the skill distribution. And there's a lot of people out there looking for jobs that have a lot of education, a lot of talent to offer. Okay? So, having said that, well, let me put a little bit of a few more numbers, throw a few more numbers at you that you might have read in the news anyway. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a website where you can follow mass layoffs. A mass layoff is defined as any layoff of at least 50 people at a single site or something along those lines. And you know, it won't come as any great shock to you that these numbers are way up, right? So if you just look at this February of 2009, there were 2,700 plus of these mass layoff events affecting essentially 300,000 people. And that's not quite double, but a good 50% more than a year ago when you were looking at about 1,700 and 183,000 people. And then, as I mentioned before, this idea that men are being affected more and blue-collar workers being particularly affected, manufacturing is really taking the brunt of it so far. Construction is another area more so than in the past. Obviously, a lot of service firms, I just listed 5 or 6 on the last slide, are having big layoffs as well, and there's a couple of more there. Starbucks has dropped tons of workers. Caterpillar, but you know, these aren't just lousy firms that suddenly are having problems. Caterpillar, a couple of years ago, you'd read in the paper, gee, this is the shining star of American manufacturing, right? Everybody wanted to buy their tractors when commodity prices were high and farming all over the world was really taking off. People were lining up to buy Caterpillar tractors, and now they have to cut back. Kodak, not so much, you know, a recent success story, if you will, but also in line with sort of laying off thousands. And each of these firms is just laying off thousands of people. So when you look at where did those unemployment numbers I just showed you come from, this is certainly a big contributor. Okay, I'm sure again that doesn't come as any shock to anybody in the room. You know, you don't have to get rid of people when times get tough. So some of you have worked in places that have probably gone out of their way never to have a layoff or have actually succeeded in never having a layoff. And there are these alternatives to laying people off. Okay, one of them is wage cuts. You see that occasionally. One of them is just force people to take more vacation or to reduce their hours. You can go cut other expenses, or you can offer voluntary severance packages, right? So instead of just saying, okay, we're gonna fire you guys and everybody else stays, we can just say, here's a severance package I'm going to offer. Anybody who wants to take it, go ahead and take it. And the question you might ask is, why don't we see firms doing this more often? And there's a little bit of research and a lot of anecdotal evidence on this. And the first couple come down to morale. Okay? So why don't we see firms going out and cutting wages instead of cutting people? The answer you'll get if I'd asked you in this room, I probably bet you would have given me this answer, because if you go out and ask managers in the real world, inevitably they come around to saying something close to morale. If you cut people's wages, morale goes down, whereas if you just sort of cut a few people and get them out of the way, the people left behind aren't as affected. Okay? Now, that's at least that's the way conventional wisdom has it. Another way of thinking about that is some firms will say, look, we're not very good at cutting out the dead wood. This gives us an excuse to go in and sort of find the underperformers, cut them all out, get rid of them, and the people left behind are more productive and happy to have their job, happy to be rid of people. Economists have a term for this, which is the cleansing effect of recessions. So recessions have certain cleansing effects. They get people to rematch to more productive types of jobs. They get capital rematched to more productive uses, things like that. Okay, so one reason to cut people is to make not one nice benefit of cutting people rather than cutting wages is it gets people reallocated in the labor force, maybe to places that are more useful. Forced vacation or hours reductions also are known for having negative effects on morale. Another thing you can do is you can just go cut expenses. Now, let me go back to that. I won't go back to it, but if you look back 2 pages in your slides, why doesn't Microsoft and Stanford University and Google just, fly coach instead of first class? And why don't they, not bring food into meetings anymore? Even at Google, at a place like Google, renowned for the food, that's just not going to do it, right? In the United States economy, wages and compensation expenses are 57% of the economy. And in a place like Stanford or a place like Microsoft, it's even a much higher fraction of your total cost structure than that. So if you get into a down economy and the costs have to be reined in, if you're Microsoft, there's no other place to rein in costs that's going to do it for you. You can cut wages dramatically, but in the absence of being willing to do that, the only other way to bring your budget into line is to cut people. Okay? That's just a fact of life. And then finally, why don't we see more voluntary severance packages? And that's the term I told you we were going to come back to, adverse selection. So you can offer volunteers, you can ask for volunteers, who wants to take my package? And under certain circumstances, that's going to work really well. And we'll talk about what circumstances those are. And under other circumstances, that's going to be pretty terrible. Because who's going to take your voluntary severance package sometimes? It's going to be the people who have other good opportunities. And if those people who have good opportunities elsewhere are also the people who are productive there at your firm, which is likely, that's going to be a real problem. So that's what I mean by adverse selection. Somebody has private information about their value, and they're going to sort of leave you behind. Okay? So let's talk about adverse selection for a second. Another labor economist here on campus is a guy named John Pencavel. He works over in the economics department at Stanford. If any of you were undergrads, you might recognize his name. So let me tell you about what happened at the UC system a few years ago. The UC system this is 2 or 3 California fiscal crises ago. So, we have these. The one we're having now is sort of epic I've lived here on and off for a long time. This current fiscal crisis is kind of epic, but it's not unusual in that it's occurring, right? So we're always having budget problems in California. And about 10 years ago, I think it was, before the crisis before the dot-com bust, the UC system had a very funny accounting situation where they had an overfunded pension plan and an underfunded operating budget. And so they wanted to move some people from their operating budget onto their pension plan. Okay? The point is they needed to get people to retire because that was just better for them. It was for very ridiculous reasons that you can only imagine some bureaucratic system getting into. It was better for them to pay people not to work than to work. Okay? So they had to figure out how to get people to retire, so they offered these very generous retirement packages. And a lot of, you had to be above a certain age and a certain number of years of service. Stanford does this all the time, not because of this accounting issue, but because they want to make way for new people and so forth. So what Pencavel did was he got the data on who took these retirement packages, tried to look at whether they were the more productive people, the better paid people, so forth. Okay, and what you'd be worried about is, in the academic world, we have very little what economists call firm-specific human capital, right? I'm an economist at Stanford. I could do my job at Berkeley or at Harvard, or I used to work at Northwestern, and it's pretty much the same job, to tell you the truth. Okay? It's a different location, but it's pretty much the same job. And so when you offer these types of retirement packages, you worry that people, your best people, are going to take them and then run off and get a new job somewhere else. Okay? So now what Pencavel found was that that's not really what happened. The only thing that was consistent in this was that it was just really hard to predict who would take the buyouts. It wasn't the most productive people. It wasn't the least productive people. It was just a random smattering of people that said, you know what? I've had enough. I'm ready to go. I'll take the package. And some were more productive and some were less. And he points out that, you can spin this story either way. Pencavel concluded in his paper, this cast doubt on arguments that maintain that buyouts are superior to employer-initiated layoffs as a mechanism to affect large employment changes. That is to say, if you took the view that if you do buyouts, you're going to get the right people, you're going to be able to craft them so that the people you want to leave, then maybe that's not going to work out. The other way of approaching this, what he found, is to say, hey, maybe it's not the case that these top performers are going to be the ones you really have to worry about taking off on me. It's just some random thing, and maybe this is as easy a way to do it as any other thing. And again, there was a related study using very similar data from the same basic set of layoffs, found no evidence of widespread adverse selection, right? But there were some very high-profile cases. So it depends on what you're worried about. At Berkeley, there was one guy, I think there are a few people on our faculty who took these buyouts and came over and started working at Stanford instead. So that would be considered a very bad outcome for Berkeley. There's even a more famous one of a person who took the buyout, went to Princeton, and subsequently won the Nobel Prize, right? So you're going to have extreme outcomes, but at the same time, for every Nobel Prize winner that left, there was at least one and a few other people that were sitting around at Berkeley just kind of going through the motions, not really enjoying their job. And when this package came along, they took it and everybody was better off. So it could work anyway. Thinking about how you're going to decide who to go about laying off and whether you're going to offer the package to everybody and so forth, that's kind of a difficult decision you're going to face. Now, one of the things you might think about is, should I be downsizing at my firm at all? And what you'll find is, you'll find a lot of people out there in the business press or, practitioners, they'll tell you don't downsize because studies show that firms that downsize do badly. Okay? And I think you should be very leery of any study that suggests that. Because think about, from the research, I do empirical research for a living for the most part, and the first thing you think about when you hear about these things is, well, that's an obvious correlation, but how's the causality on that working? And the answer is, we can never, as social scientists, think about what's the effect of downsizing on firm performance, because we never, ever have anything close to a random assignment or any sort of experiment. We never know what would have happened to a firm that has a layoff if it hadn't had one, or what would have happened to the firm if they don't have one, had they chosen to have one. Okay? Firms that downsize are firms that have problems, and you just never, if you look at sort of the correlation between outcomes of firms that downsize and whether they do or not, it's always going to look badly. Now, Having said that, I can tell you that it's very clear that a poorly executed workforce reduction is going to be a real problem in terms of your firm going forward. So there are a lot of nice anecdotes and less systematic research on just how you don't do on what you do and don't do in terms of having a downsizing event. And certainly as you approach one, if you ever get to that, you should be sort of thinking through some of the best practices that people have developed and written about. But having said that, it's not, I'm not going to tell you not to do it as much as I'd like to save a lot of people's jobs. It's just not obvious that it's the good or that it's a bad or a good thing on average. Now, having said that, what we can do as social scientists pretty well is come to conclusions about the effects on employees. And I'm afraid to say that that's not a good story. Okay? So losing your job is really bad in many ways. Now, the way we can measure best is the financial implications. And on average, they're terrible. Okay? So where and when you lose your job makes a big difference. So I can tell you a couple of things about losing your job. On average, it's a really bad thing. And then the other thing is the effect of it on your future is just incredibly variable. So I've looked at individual downsizing in individual companies, and I've followed up people a year or two later. And what you find is that for some people, this is the best thing that ever happened to them. Financially, they may have had a nervous breakdown in the middle, and then it probably wasn't worth the trouble. But there are a lot of people who lose their jobs and serendipitously or strategically or whatever find something that they enjoy much more or where they make a lot more money later anyway. So those are the nice sides of laying people off. Unfortunately, those are not typical. So there are a lot of people for whom negative effects of losing your job just last a really long time. And then the other thing to keep in mind is, as economists, we usually look at the effect on your income in the long term or the short term. But that's a real big understatement of the cost of losing your job. There are other social scientists who show that there are pretty strong correlations between job loss and a lot of other things. Divorce, health problems, and some of that's driven by the fact that you lose your health insurance and you don't get looked after, and some of it's driven by the fact that you smoke more or you exercise less because you're depressed or something. But the point is, we can only sort of think about, gee, the effects here on average are really bad. And then when you take into account the other effects, they're that much worse. So when you look at these numbers I showed you before about layoffs, keep in mind that people are really suffering as a result of that. I don't know why you should keep that in mind. You'll be a happier person if you can forget it. But it's just a fact of life. So a couple of things you find is if you lose your job and you've held it for a long time, that's worse. Okay, that won't come as any great surprise to you. If you've been working in a job for 30 years and you're much more productive at that particular employer than you could be anywhere else, then having that job taken out from under you is going to strip away all of what I referred to a few minutes ago as firm-specific human capital, and that's going to make your financial problems much worse. If your industry overall is declining, that's going to be a big problem. So if you're in the car industry in Michigan right now, it's a really bad time to lose your job. Why? Because there is nobody else out there that can. You've developed these skills that are very useful to auto manufacturers, and there is nobody else out there that wants these, that can take advantage of these skills right now. Now you can move south and get hired at one of the, Toyota or BMW factories in Alabama or Kentucky or wherever, but even that right now, those places are not hiring either. And then there's a little bit of evidence. This is much more mixed, which says you want to lose your job because your company fails rather than because your company goes through a layoff and says, we're going to get rid of this guy and we're going to keep this guy and this guy because of a stigma side to it. The evidence on that isn't overwhelming, but it's there. Okay, so there's a little bit of a stigma to working for a firm that lays you off, and there's not such a stigma to working at a .com that crashes or something like that, or a tech company that crashes. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, and the reason we're all thinking about this right now is if you lose your job in a recession, that's kind of a bad situation because now you're running around looking for a job along with lots of other people that, the other 10% or whatever the number ends up being, that are unemployed at the same time. Whereas if you lost your job, in 1999 here in Silicon Valley because your particular .com, their business plan was more obviously crappy faster than everybody else's became obvious. That wasn't so bad. You lost your job and you got hired on somewhere else, and there wasn't a big deal to it then. Okay, you probably lost it again a year later, but that's another story. So when you think about this strategically as managers and you say, okay, the time has come, I got to do some laying off, who are you going to let go? And sometimes the union or the government makes this easy on you. They say you don't really have a choice. You have this collective bargaining agreement with the union which says we're going to do it by seniority or by age or whatever. Sometimes, all of you probably are local, but usually when I talk to students in our MBA program, many of them are going to go practice as managers in foreign countries, and those places are going to have rules on how you do this that are going to give you some guidance as to who you're going to lay off when. Here, we don't sort of have, if you have a non-union work environment in the United States, you typically have a lot more leeway in deciding exactly who you want to lay off. So then you need to think about the following things, right? So I'm sure this idea isn't shocking to anybody, but when you think about layoffs, you've got to think about not just that particular layoff, but the effects on the organization's reputation going forward. Everything you do has an effect on your reputation going forward, but layoffs are one that come back and haunt firms a lot. Okay, so it's well known. It took Bain, who's one of our biggest employers of MBAs historically here at the business school, years to get over the layoffs they had. Okay, they did some layoffs back in the 80s, and it just killed them in on-campus hiring for a long, long time. Okay, so in places like that where there's a reputation effect and word of mouth among the people that are going to be getting recruited, in that case it was just having a layoff that ruined their reputation. But if you have one that goes badly or where you seem to make your choices in an ad hoc manner about who's going to be laid off and so forth, that can have real problems. And you want to think about the message you send. And so why do firms offer generous severance packages? Sometimes it's to be nice, and sometimes it's to take care of the reputational effects going forward. I'm sure in a lot of cases it's more the reputational effect than the being nice idea. Okay, so now, I can't help myself. Whenever I give a talk to any group, I have to write down my favorite equation. This is the equation I live by as a labor economist, and that is people's productivity in any given. Think of this as sort of how much do I produce for Stanford University in a year. That's a combination of three things, and I'm going to write it as plus, but for some of you who are engineers and you'd rather have a more interesting differential equation sort of thing, I could make it be sort of a nonlinear combination of some sort or another. But I'll just write this in the most simple way. Every year, I have some amount of productivity here at Stanford. Every year, Erica has some amount of productivity here at Stanford in terms of the value she generates for the university and the value I generate for the university. And there are there are traders for whom on Wall Street for whom their productivity is more measurable than ours, but you can imagine what's going, that they have some productivity measure out there. And it really comes down to three things. I might be good or not good at being an economist. I might just be smart or not smart. I might be a particularly good fit for Stanford University. Okay? And so, like I said, I think as university professors, this part's not very important. I can do my job. I used to work at the Kellogg School. Pretty much the same job. Okay? I now teach in the new curriculum here. It's a little different, but, not really that big a deal. And then the third thing is, in any given year, I'm just going to have some good luck or some bad luck that's going to affect my productivity or my perceived productivity. Okay? So this is a really important thing to think about when doing layoffs. Why? Well, suppose after a while you've sort of figured this out. But when you go to lay people off, if this isn't a very important part of your business model, that is, all you need is really smart people, then when you go to lay people off, you want to think about, well, I'm going to keep the really smart people. But labor, I like to think of labor market's like any other market, and what I want isn't the best. Okay, I mean, you can look at my clothes and you can tell this, right? I don't want the best. I want the best deal. Okay? And how do I get a good deal? I find somebody, and this is where we spend tons of time thinking strategically in the big picture about how this happens in your business. I would love to find, and it's not always possible, but I would love to find people who are better in my environment than anywhere else. Okay? That can either be because they just match to me very well. If any of you have graduated recently enough to remember the case on SAS Institute, the software company, or the Southwest Airlines case. These are great cases of people that match the culture and all that sort of stuff. Or it can be a matter of, I bring you in and I teach you a lot of stuff that's really valuable here. The point is, okay, so that's the background on the basic HR class that we, as we teach it currently. Now, the thing to keep in mind about this is, that's a nice story about building human capital and all these and all the things we teach people. But when the time comes to do the dirty work of firing people or laying people off, who do you want to lay off? Well, frankly, if this isn't a very important part of your business model, it really doesn't matter that much. Because if you fire the high ability, if you don't have much in the way of this, then if you offer up these voluntary severance packages, people are going to leave or not leave. The best people are going to leave, but you probably had to pay them the most to keep them anyway. Okay? But if this is really an important part of your business model, like it is in a couple of examples that I just mentioned before, then you have to be really careful about who you lay off. And you want to be very careful to think carefully about who are the people that are particularly valuable, that have a lot of firm-specific human capital, and who fit really well in my organization. Now, having said that, if that's obvious to everybody who these people are, then you actually can go back and have the voluntary severance package. Because, I mean, not in the current, the thing is you can't do it in the current economy. In the current economy, you can't do voluntary severance. All this talk about adverse selection is just way exacerbated, right? Because nobody wants to take a package in the current environment. Very few people do. Okay? But in normal times, when you're thinking about layoffs, if the match value is a particularly important part of your productivity for workers at your organization, then people are going to self-select in and out in a way that's not going to give you the adverse selection I was worried about before. Having said that, you can't always count on people knowing all of this stuff, and maybe you've sort of got a compensation system where not all of this is obvious to your workers and so forth. So all I'm saying is, depending on sort of the relative weights on these particular items in productivity in terms of your employees, that's going to have a big effect on who you want to lay off. And anybody who's really strong in this particular part of things, you really want to hold on to and be very careful not to offer them a package or not to let them get away. Okay? And then, again, local labor market conditions, this is what I was just sort of hinting at before. When we're in the kind of conditions we are now where it's so hard to find a job, you want to be more careful about getting rid of the right people because nobody is going to really want to leave. And so you can't sort of count on people to take care of that for you. Now, I'm bored with this layoff stuff. I'm beginning to be a downer. So let's be a little happier for a second. Suppose you're one of these companies. Every day, by the way, you hear about layoffs and mass layoffs and all the stuff we've talked about. On the rosier side, like if you want to feel better about the world, look in the classifieds. You have to go online now, of course. You can't look in the Merc for this anymore. But look like on monster.com or somewhere like that. You cannot believe how many jobs there are available right now. They're being listed. There are tons of jobs open. Now, there are 4 tons of people looking for that 1 ton of jobs, but there are a lot of jobs open. And every day, every week, thousands of people in the United States economy, even with all the horror stories you're hearing, are getting new jobs. Some of them aren't as good as they wanted for the reasons we discussed before about underemployment, but a lot of people are getting new jobs. And if you happen to be a firm out there and you have a job open right now, that's great. You know, this is an exciting opportunity for you. Okay? So you're getting tons of great resumes, and you're thinking, gee, this is the greatest time to be hiring. Or is it? Okay, and the only two caveats to this being a great time to hire are the following. One is you got to do a lot more screening, right? So instead of getting 10 resumes, you're getting 400 for one opening or something. And then the other thing is this adverse selection question we just talked about is going to rear its ugly head again in the following way. This is a great time to go find qualified people, and then you have to ask yourself, do I want to go the next step and hire overqualified people? Okay? So, this is a question a lot of firms are facing right now. And let me just give you three very simple examples. Suppose you're a commercial bank here in Silicon Valley, some bank that loans to local corporations. And you're sitting there, and all of a sudden, instead of getting resumes from other commercial bankers and accountants that want to become commercial bankers, you're getting resumes from guys who just got laid off from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch. People who are real high flyers in finance, hopefully not the ones who brought down the whole economy, but whatever. You're getting people who used to work at hedge funds. Do you want to go hire those people and take a chance on that? And suddenly maybe, you have this much more high-skilled, more creative group of finance professionals than you ever were able to tap before? Or I mentioned, law firms a few times. Lawyers are getting laid off all over the place in New York and San Francisco from top-notch firms. Suppose you're some little local firm in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has some very top-notch firms too, but suppose you're, one that can't compete at that level, and all of a sudden you're getting resumes from people who went to Stanford and then spent a few years at Wilson Sonsini. I don't know if they've had a layoff, but some other big law firm that's had a layoff recently. Do you want to? What's that? What? Orrick. Did they have one? I didn't happen to notice them in the. But okay, good. There's actually firms shutting down now as well. Anyway, do you want to take those people on or not? And then think about this year, economists, we just went through the hiring process for new economists. And I wanted to go out and hire a lot of people because we need them, schools being a little bit sort of bothered by the fact that our endowment is down just a wee bit from a few years ago. They're letting that get in the way of our hiring practices. But anyway, as a result, places like Stanford were much less aggressive in hiring this year. And so you had people who could go out, you had junior economists who would have gotten jobs at Harvard, Princeton, Stanford in a typical year. And the question is, suppose you're a little further down the pecking order, do you want to go after those guys? Is this your year to make your move or not? And of course the answer is, to all these questions would be sure, why not, if it weren't for the fact that you have to think again about adverse selection. How am I going to know whether, when the market turns around in 2 years, is the commercial banker going to take off on me? Is the lawyer going to go back to Orrick when Orrick is hiring again? And is the economist going to leave and jump back to a top-tier school? And so here are some things to consider. One is history. Experiment. I'd do it. Right? Maybe not with all of your jobs, but with some. Why? Because how are you ever going to know if it works if you haven't tried it? So look at your history and say, when we did this in the past, did it work or not? You try it. Experimentation is really good. Then you'll know when the next recession comes whether it was a good idea or not. I personally have tried this. I always used to worry about if I got a research assistant applying for a job to work for me, I was very leery of hiring overqualified people to give them pretty rote tasks for fear that they would, thinking they were just there to try to get a letter of reference from somebody at Stanford Business School, and when they saw how boring the task I was asking them to do really was, they were going to run. And I've learned my lesson. I've stopped, hiring overqualified research assistants. And maybe that was right. That's what my conclusion was, but maybe that's not going to be your conclusion. Maybe you go ahead and hire the lawyer. Turns out the lawyer finds out that working in this lower pressure environment often is more interesting, and they stay. So question number one is, what's your history with this? If you don't have a history with it, give it a shot and develop a history. Okay, I'm a big fan of experimenting with various practices and seeing how it goes. You have to be careful because if you just do it once or twice, that doesn't tell you that much, but still. Okay, so then the next thing to think about is this whole idea we talked about, it's about specific skills. If lawyers at your firm are going to learn to do things differently than somewhere else, That, on the one hand, says, yes, go for it. Hire the overqualified guy because I'm going to teach him or her these special skills they develop here, and they're going to want to stick with me, and even when times take off again, they're going to have these specialized skills and want to stick around. That's the positive side. The negative side is, geez, actually, 2 years from now, by the time they've learned all the special things I do at this company, Oric's going to want them back, and I won't have even gotten anything out of them yet because they will have just learned all the stuff I need to teach them. So that's a double-edged sword. These specific skills are really, you need to stop and think carefully about the way they affect so many of your human resource practices. But in terms of adverse selection, it's a really important one. Because if it takes a long time to get people to be productive, that's a problem if they're going to leave. But on the other hand, if that keeps them attached, then that's fine. And then again, suppose you're just looking for salespeople or economists, people who are transferable skills, and or most lawyers, and the day they show up, they're really productive. That's a pretty good argument. On the one hand, they may take off when times pick up. On the other hand, that's a pretty good argument for taking a chance because, they come in, everybody's better off for a couple of years, a marriage of convenience, and if it doesn't last longer than that, so be it. If turnover is really costly in your particular organization, not such a good strategy. Things to balance all over the place here, and that's why, it might be obvious in your context what to do or not, and if it's not, I say experiment. Give it a shot. Our former dean here at the business school was Michael Spence, and he won the Nobel Prize for this idea of costly signaling. Okay, so employers, the idea, he used a different example, but the way it's relevant here is, suppose Mike wants to hire a guy, and he's thinking, how can I get this guy to tell me whether or not he's really willing to take this job and keep it for a while? Okay? And so, you only want overqualified people. Suppose in your case, you're afraid of him leaving or you're afraid of him being demotivated while he's there. So how could you figure out whether this is an issue? One way you can do it is during the job interview, you can say to him, will you stay when the economy recovers, and are you going to think this job's beneath you and act like a jerk while you're working here? And you can ask that during the interview. And honestly, I think you should ask that during the interview because there are a few people out there stupid enough to say in the heat of the moment, well, and then you know, right? And it happens. Like I would have told you until I'd sort of read some articles recently, I would have told you never ask that question because anybody who takes 30 seconds before the interview is going to say, oh, of course, they're going to act enthusiastic. You should still ask the question. But once they say yes, and they might even mean it, that doesn't really tell you anything. What you want to extract from them is the true answer to that question in another form. Okay? And one way to do, and so what you need is to think about creative ways to get more honest answers to that question. Now, one way that is you can just spend a lot of time with the person and very intensive screening for whether they fit in the organization, whether they're going to like that job and so forth. And really, you should do some reading on what's known as experiential interviewing. I'm not an expert on this, but I do, a couple of things I know about the hiring process is that I, like almost everybody else, walk into interviews and sort of read when I'm interviewing someone, read the resume on the way in and then, shoot the breeze for a half hour. I used to. And I've become much more, it's just so obvious that spending 10 minutes going over 10 minutes is all we're talking about, going over someone's resume and thinking carefully, what piece of information do I want to get from this person? And how am I going to extract it when I can't just ask that question? And there are articles that will give you some ideas on what's known as experiential interviewing, where you keep drilling deeper and deeper. And in essence, in your case, you want to keep asking the question over and over again, are you going to think this job is beneath you? And you're going to ask for examples of where the person did something that might have seemed beneath them and they did a great job and moved on and saw it as a victory and so forth. So that's one way, is a lot of intensive screening. It's time consuming, but it might be worth it. Okay. Another way is just a lot of backloading of pay or a lot of promises that are off in the long term. So the person has to go through the costly process of essentially promising to stay there a long time to get any sort of reward that they might be willing to expect. Okay? So you can backload pay or promotions. You can structure pay in a way that only those who are going to fit in your particular organization will accept it. So what's a good example? Well, the SAS case that I talked about before is a good example here, where SAS sort of doesn't pay people just money. They also pay them all these sorts of benefits that are correlated with the types, with the things, with the preferences of the types of people they like. Okay? And so you can do things like that. That's very hard to work out exactly how you do it in this situation. I don't particularly recommend this in most cases, but another thing to do is, you really want to know whether this person really wants your job or not, ignore them for a while. Okay? And, you know, you have 10 overqualified people looking for your job, ignore them for a while and see who's the one who really pesters you a lot. I mean, if it becomes pestering, then it's obviously not relevant. But sort of, you know, play hard to get is one way of thinking about it. Another way of saying that is try to gauge people's actual enthusiasm by giving them the chance to sort of be the one that make moves and try to keep the process going. That tells you a little bit about somebody's situation. Unfortunately, you got to be careful. That's not sufficient, right? It also might tell you they're late on their car payments and their house is being foreclosed relative to someone else who has more money in the bank and would be better at the job, but just isn't as short, you know, as strapped right now. So, you know, don't rely completely on that, but it's something. So, in some ways, competitive labor markets have an advantage, right? You have all these people out there now that you didn't used to have access to, but the good news is, if you make somebody an offer and they have 3 other great offers and they take your job, that's a really strong signal about the fit that person's going to have. And right now, you can't be as sure about that. And you want to try to figure out other ways to have that same level of comfort, even if the person is particularly highly qualified. And, you know, in a given firm's context, I can't tell you exactly what that is, but try to think about the idea of signaling. You know, if Spence can get the Nobel Prize for it, it must be pretty good. So let me talk quickly about incentives in a recession. Let me go through this really quickly because I want to talk about my the research paper I mentioned before. So you've all read a lot about the AIG bonus flap. I'm not going to talk about that. You know, it reminds us of a lot of really important issues. When you think about designing pay plans, keep in mind things like whether there's an outrage, you know, how outrageous is it going to... Another way of saying the outrage constraint comes up is when you think about designing pay and other incentive systems in your firm, think about if that system is on the front page of the newspaper tomorrow, is that going to be a problem for you? And if the answer is no, then, you know, in most cases, it's not going to be an issue. And even, you know, nobody could have imagined what was going to happen at AIG when they designed those systems. So in some ways, that's not even that relevant. Obviously, those taking government money have to think about a whole different set of incentive issues than most of us have to think about. But what it does also bring up is some more important issues about how pay and incentives in recessions sort of work. So I think you should keep in mind that when we talk about incentive systems, you mostly focus on motivating workers through incentive systems. But incentive systems have a big other, another important facet of them is they keep people's pay in line with market values. Okay? So in order to so when we think about adjusting incentive systems during recessions, we have to think about, you know, both of these things. So what do we do when we motivate? Well, your pay system has to be 2 things. It has to obviously be related to things the employee can affect. So if you give somebody an incentive system and the measure you're using isn't something they have a very direct effect over, it's not going to be that useful. That's kind of obvious. And then the other, but for reasons we'll discuss in a second related to the state of the economy, and the other thing is it has to be perceived as fair. Okay? And different people have different perceptions of fairness, but sort of getting whacked in your pay schedule because the macroeconomy fell apart, is that fair? Well, a lot of people don't think it is. And if you work at AIG right now, and you work in the insurance part of the company, and you had nothing to do with credit default swaps, why should your bonus suffer? Now, that's not what the fuss has been about. Well, one place, if you worked at AIG, you might really has a big sort of management problem is thinking about, gee, how are we going to handle the bonus structures within the parts of the organization that had nothing to do with this and that are actually funding the recovery of the company in the meanwhile. So the goals of keeping your market pay in line of keeping your pay in line with the market and of motivating people, those goals can sometimes conflict with one another, just as the goal of keeping things fair and making sure your incentives are related to things employees can affect. Those can sometimes come into conflict. So let me give you an example. You're trying to decide what should I do with my incentive systems for my salespeople right now. On the one hand, you might be suppose you were an organization that sold certain products that just kind of sold themselves and flew off the shelves during good times. And now the salespeople were making a lot of money, but frankly they didn't have to do that much to make that much money. And now things have slowed down, and now the returns to salesperson effort have gone way up. Actually, you want to provide a lot more motivation for people right now. You want to be paying more incentives than you used to. Okay? On the other hand, suppose the salespeople really had to fight with the competitors during the good times to get the sales, and right now nobody's buying, and it's kind of a waste of their time to be out working real hard. Then you'd want to be pulling back on your incentive systems right now. And maybe it's sort of somewhere in the middle, and you just leave things where it is. But an implication of this is, if you have a very sort of pay-for-performance-oriented world, you've got to think carefully about how those schemes are going to react when the value of somebody's effort changes over time. And sales force compensation schemes need to be changing a little bit right now. And some people, so at the very least, for salespeople, for other managers, you have to rethink their targets and their quotas as well as sort of the pay-performance relationship. And the question is, should salespeople suffer if they can't reach their target? Suppose you're a money manager and you manage the Stanford portfolio right now, and the value of it's dropped pretty dramatically. Should I make that person suffer for these two things? And on the one hand, you'd say no. Firms' job is to insure their workers against macroeconomic shocks, because otherwise, employees, there'd be too much luck involved in what they do, and they wouldn't have as much motivation, given that it was all, there wasn't a relationship between what they did and the outcomes. Also, there's a sense of fairness issue. On the other hand, you might say, I'm going to let my money managers suffer as their portfolio value drops, and I'm going to let my salespeople suffer because they're not reaching their targets, because what are they going to do? They can't quit right now. Their other options stink, right? So this is kind of, incentive pay is a means of recouping some of the compensation expenses that you might otherwise, some of the expenses overall that you might be suffering in the marketplace, right? So as people who have strong incentive systems aren't performing by the old measures, you may or may not want to redesign their targets depending on kind of this value of their work and so forth. And two good examples of this, I just mentioned the AIG example. Should they be adjusting the pay to employees in successful parts of their business? And I mean, I'm sort of torn on this, and I need to know the AIG context a little better. But on the one hand, you've got to say, the guys selling insurance at AIG that have been successful all along, they shouldn't be suffering at all in this environment. On the other hand, you might say, well, look, the shareholders are taking it in the chin for what the credit default swap guys did, and the people in these other divisions lined up with them as well, and they have to sort of ride the down wave along with the shareholders and the rest of the organization. Another thing to think about is, I have a friend who works here at Stanford, used to be in the business school, now working for the organization as a whole, and his job is to raise money. Well, I don't know what for all I know, I bet he doesn't have any sort of incentive compensation scheme, but as an economist, as an academic exercise, you might think, what would be the right way to pay that guy? And you'd pay him based on how much money he raised and so forth. And the question is, he's not raising nearly as much money right now as he was a year or two ago. And should his pay be suffering for that? Or do I want to ramp up his incentive systems because maybe a year or two ago he was just sitting back collecting checks for people who had a lot of money, and now is when the real value for this guy's work comes, and I want to really ramp up his incentive system. And I don't have the answer to that, but it's a question that if I did know carefully about the production function of people who raise money at the organization, I would think very carefully about how I would adjust that right now. Let me move on to the last topic, and that is how when you graduate affects things. So every year, you pick up the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and they'll have an article about the job market this year. And you walk the halls here in Stanford Business School or in the Stanford Economics Department where the PhD students are all going out on the academic job market. And every year there's press coverage and discussion and gossip about how's the market. And I always found that kind of silly in the old days because, of course, you want to, people took on significant expenses and they want to get a good first job and all that. But you might think, it really doesn't matter what happens right out the gate because people have long careers, and if you have a Stanford MBA and, you make a mistake or you don't get the job you want, later on you'll gravitate towards things. People job hop a lot and so forth. And this is especially true for MBAs, lawyers, economists, people who have very little specific, where the labor markets are very mobile and the jobs are fairly replicable from place to place. Now, here's a quote from back in when I have an MBA. I was in business school during the 1987 crash, so I sort of know a little bit about what our current set of students are going through. So this is taken from an old New York Times article. So this is a Columbia MBA. And she says, back in January of 87, Wall Street was booming. The job offers rolled in. Students played one house against another. They were the supply and the demand was strong. After the crash, the receptions that had once played to packed houses were drawing a few dozen students. Out went the tenderloin on toast of the shrimp. It came the dips and the hot dog. And the school placement officer, this is the key, the last sentence is the important part here. School placement officer sent out a memo suggesting career flexibility for finance majors. We should look into opportunities in manufacturing and consulting. And when I saw that sort of idea, I thought, well, that's fine. But wouldn't you think that even if this person who's a finance major goes out and works at General Motors, back then that wasn't that people still did that, or McKinsey for a while, then they can switch into Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley later on when the market recovers. And we know what happened 20 years later. The markets have more than recovered. And you might think it really didn't matter whether she graduated in 89 or 87 before the market crashed. Well, empirically, I can tell you that that's not quite true. So this is I got a survey. We did a survey of Stanford GSB alums this is a 10-year-old survey now. And this is the classes of 1970 through 1995. And it's a pretty simple graph where the blue line tells you what fraction of the graduating class took their first job in investment banking. And I'm defining an investment banker here as someone who works for an investment bank, someone who manages money, or someone who works for a venture capital firm. We didn't have so many people in private equity back then. I would obviously include them if I updated this. Okay? So the blue line is the investment banking jobs. The red line is what was the return on the S&P 500 during the 2 years these people were in school. And you can see the correlation there is far from perfect, but it's also very strong. Okay? The lines move together in a pretty reasonably strong manner. So now, what I told you is this woman from Columbia, she graduates around here. You could see the stock market return. For those of you who aren't old enough, there was this crash in 87, right? Returns went way down for a couple of years. And then, so there were very few investment bankers coming out of Stanford back then. And what I said to you a minute ago was, well, should that really matter? Or shouldn't they just, a few years later when the stock market recovers, Virginia Brown, or whatever her name was on the last slide, and our Stanford GSB grads who didn't go into finance because the market wasn't doing well and the opportunities weren't there, won't they just move into finance later? And the answer is pretty unequivocally no. Okay? So this shows you, let me tell you what this graph is. It's the blue line there is the same as the line on the last graph. It's just what fraction of the Stanford class in this graduating year went into investment banking immediately. And then So for the class of it's easiest to see it, although my point is weakest for the class of 75. In the class of 75, this fraction went into investment banking originally. In 4 years after graduation, this fraction of them were working in investment banking. 7 years after, this fraction were working. So this is the class of 75. This is the same class, and this is them in 1975. This is them in 1979. This is them in 1982. And this is them in 1985. Okay, so it doesn't, the correlation, the lines aren't right on top of each other for the class of 75. But you can see for pretty much every other class, these effects are really long term. The guys who start in investment banking stay in investment banking. And the people who start down some other track stay on that other track. Now, maybe it's because they can't get back, or maybe it's because they just suddenly over time they develop other skills and they find that, this is what they do and so forth. I have a friend who's been working in investment banking for 20 years, and he's like the perfect version of this story. We graduated from college. He kind of, by happenstance, found his way to an investment bank, has worked there ever since. And why did he go there? Because he graduated at a time when they were looking for people. And why has he stayed there? I can tell you why. Because he developed some very specific skills, and because he got used to the income. Right? So I'm going to use terms like industry-specific, human capital, all that. With investment bankers, a lot of it is, once you get used to making that much money, you're kind of stuck. Okay? And that's part of it in some cases. I'm not saying that's an overall statement. But the point is, these effects turn out to be really long-term. So the people who are graduating now, the key results in that whole paper are random shocks have long-term ramifications. If this S&P 500 increases by 20% while you're in college while you're in business school and you compare that class to a class where there was 0 return, 1/7, that'll increase any individual in that class of going into investment banking by 1/7. Not a huge amount, but it's something. Okay? And then most of that effect survives for 25 years, at least 50%, depending on how you look at the estimates in this research paper, maybe up to 80%. And so I'm not going to bore you with trying to tell you about the details of the model I try to work out in this paper, but it tells you that these guys get very finance-specific skills very quickly, and it also tells you that in your typical Stanford graduating class, there's a pretty deep pool of people who could be investment bankers, and some end up being it and some don't, somewhat by random reasons, and then they just follow that path because once you go down one path. Now, there are exceptions to this, by the way, of course. There are people who start in consulting or high-tech who go to investment banking. There are certainly people who start in investment banking that get off that track. But there's really strong staying power in terms of the initial things you do. And then the financial ramifications are pretty important. So I try to do the following thought experiment in this paper. Suppose you have two people, one of whom starts on Wall Street and one of whom starts somewhere else. How much extra money, and it's just random which one went which way because of the state of Wall Street when they graduated. That turns out to have something on the order of a $1 to $3 million lifetime effect on people. Okay? And that was back in the 90s when $1 to $3 million still meant something. All right? And you can see this in the following graph where if you take that data of graduates, these are incomes, average incomes for investment bankers 1 year out, 2 year out. This is as of 1996, 97, whenever the survey was done. These are investment bankers with 15 years experience on the top. And you can see, comparing that with, these are people in consulting, these are people who are entrepreneurs. That's probably poorly estimated for reasons I won't get into. And this is just general manager types. And you can see that the extra money, those of you who graduated and are not investment bankers, you're making much less on average than your classmates who are investment bankers. It's just a pretty dramatic difference in terms of finance. And so what's the effect? When I think about, so what does this mean? Well, my friend who raises money for the school should be thinking carefully about the ramifications for this. So if the S&P 500 is 20% higher for a given class, extra 7 people from that class will go to Wall Street, which means that graduating class is going to have income to donate back to the school, or to do whatever else they want to do with, on the order of $7 to $20 million extra over the first 20 years of their career. But the numbers get much more dramatic when you compare the classes right before the crash of '87 to the classes right after, where about 50 people over that 4-year period got switched into Wall Street in the earlier classes relative to the later classes. And as a result, those guys that graduated right before the crash, a few of them lost their jobs during the crash, but a lot of them held on and were long-term investment bankers. And that group, as a class, the class of '86 and '87, I think they made on the order of $50 to $150 million extra. And so who should we be out looking for money from? Who should we be banging the doors to get us to give money? Well, it wasn't the classes of '88 and '89, and I don't think it's going to be the class of 2009 and 2010. Now, on a percentage basis on the overall class, that's not really that high an amount. And I think the class of 2009 and 2010 might end up donating just as much money or making almost as much money, but I predict they're going to make a little less. There are going to be a lot fewer of them in managing hedge funds, even 10 years from now. That's what I'm guessing. The broader conclusions from my work and others are that you find very similar effects if you look for college graduates as a whole. I also did a study of PhD economists. But I want to make an important key caveat. Of all my work, this is the one that's been written up in the newspaper the most, which is to say it's like been written up a little bit, right? So, and so the thing I don't like about when the press gets on this particular thing is they make it seem like it's all luck. And that's wrong. Luck plays a big part in sort of these first steps you take, and these has long and lasting effects. But I'd much rather be good than lucky. Okay? And so it's always better to graduate in good times. I'd rather graduate when the job market's good because that's going to give you more options and that'll have long-term positive ramifications. But I'd much rather be highly skilled and graduate right now than have low skills and graduate in a good market. Okay, so I'd much rather have high skill than good luck. Okay, so that takes you through a little bit about what our students are, times are tough, right? So that's true for you as managers, true for our students graduating. And I hope, 4 things, the 4 points I wanted to talk about that I hope we covered are A, times are tough. We saw that in some of the unemployment figures. B, picking and keeping people is a very important thing. And, it's a good opportunity to look for opportunities and to think long-term about who you want to keep and who you want to pick. But, at the same time, that presents challenges along the adverse selection line that we discussed. It's a good time to stop and think about your incentive plans and how you might change the motivation and retention parts of that. And then just, again, I don't know that there's much to do with this other than find it interesting or not, depending on how you feel about it. But our current graduates are going to be affected by this recession for a long time, not necessarily in a bad way. Nothing I said, I think that the investment bankers make that extra money, but they give a lot of it back in other ways, extra time at work, living in places that are expensive and so forth. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming.